Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded event for GCSE Science 2011 Physics. Feedback on the June 2015 Unit 1 examination. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy, as we will refer to them during the session. These are the aims and objectives of the course. The first question we will look at is from the higher paper. It is one of the two extended writing items on the paper. This response scored full marks, as it clearly explained the difference between longitudinal and transverse waves, using appropriate technical language and quoting appropriate examples. Candidates who did well in this type of question had a clear understanding of the physics and were able to structure their responses in a logical order, addressing all points in the question. This candidate also discussed uses for the waves. This was not required in the question, but did not detract from the answer. However, the danger with straying from the question is that candidates may run out of answer space. This response to the same question also scored full marks, but was more concise and did not include as much extra material. It showed that the answer space provided was sufficient to answer the question. This response was able to identify some of the examples as either longitudinal or transverse, but did not explain the differences between the two types of wave. It did attempt to point out some differences between two waves, light and sound, for example, but this was not what the question required. This was a Level 1 answer, scoring 2 marks. Many 6-mark questions test knowledge and understanding. This is an opportunity for those candidates who have revised well and practiced constructing logical responses to score well. This question is from the foundation paper. It required candidates to analyze two unfamiliar graphs and make some comparisons. Candidates who did well noticed the differences between the graphs and referred to the axes in their descriptions, as did this candidate. This was a calculation from the foundation paper. The rearranged equation was given in the question, but the value for power had to be converted from kilowatts to watts. The conversion is clearly shown in the working here, and the final answer is correct. This scores all 3 marks. The unit conversion has not been done here, but this was the only error, and the working is shown, so it scored 2 marks. In calculation questions, the correct numerical answer scored full marks, even without working being shown. However, it is advisable to show working at each step, so that marks can be gained even if the final numerical answer is not correct. This is particularly important when unit conversions or rearrangement of equations are involved. Activity 1 is based on question 3B, Part 3, from the higher tier paper. Using the mark scheme, decide on what mark you think this should be awarded and why. At this point, you may wish to pause the video to carry out the activity. This question requires candidates to analyze and evaluate evidence and draw conclusions based on the evidence. In the response shown, the candidate has marked the points on the graph. Most successful candidates did the calculations by substituting the time into the equation and then comparing the calculated distance with the distance taken from the graph. This candidate divided the distance by the time for each point to see how close this was to 8, as in the equation. This is a perfectly acceptable method. Appropriate comments about the shape of the graph compared to the straight line predicted by the equation could also gain full marks. Some candidates simply described the graph, saying that as the distance from the earthquake increased, the time increased. This would only score the first mark if it identified at least 2 points from the graph, as in this example. Less successful candidates either did not read the question thoroughly or did not understand what was required. This is a calculation from question 6 on the higher tier paper. The equation has 4 terms in it, and a rearrangement is required. A decision must also be made about the unit for power. This candidate has attempted to show working, but seems to be trying to do everything at once. This response scored 0. For all calculations, particularly more complex ones such as this, the best place to start is by substituting the given values into the equation. This has 2 benefits. Firstly, it usually gains the first mark for the question. Secondly, it might clarify the next step for the candidate. This response clearly scores the first mark for substituting the value into the equation, but then rearranges the equation incorrectly, so scores only 1 mark. Calculations involving rearranging equations will be set on the higher paper. A simple but effective routine for doing all calculations is: select the correct equation from the list at the front of the paper. Substitute the given values into this equation, making any necessary unit changes. For example, changing hours to seconds. Rearrange the equation if that is required. Use a calculator to get the final answer. This question is from the foundation tier paper. It was one of the 2 extended writing items on the paper. This response scored no marks. It presented no evidence either for or against the geocentric model of the solar system. This candidate seems to have read the introduction to the question and not the question itself. This candidate describes the evidence against the geocentric model with good detail, but does not offer any evidence for the geocentric model. This response was level 2, scoring 4 marks. In extended writing questions, there is often an introduction which is meant to focus attention on the command line of the question. Candidates must make sure they can identify the command line. This will usually contain words such as describe or explain or compare. In this question, a detailed description of evidence for and against the model, with the detail in at least one piece of evidence, was the minimum required for full marks. Activity 2 is based on the same extended writing question. Using the mark scheme, decide on what mark you think this should be awarded and why. At this point, you may wish to pause the video to carry out the activity. This candidate has presented evidence for and against the model, with the detail being in the evidence against. Improvements can be made in all these issues if candidates practice the suggestions made earlier when they are attempting questions in past papers and other support material. Here are some useful links for examination statistics and grade boundaries. We have just published our specifications on the Edexcel website. They have been published early in draft form to enable teachers to have early sight of our proposed approach. We are also running a series of launch events. Our draft specifications and sample assessment material, as well as further information about our launch events, can be found on edexcel.com. Thank you for taking part in this event. You will soon receive an email directing you to an online feedback form. The form takes no more than a couple of minutes to complete. Please let us know your thoughts by filling in this short form.